The Homeless Man Who Saved a Billionaire's Daughter. Chapter 2, The Shadow in the Alley. The blare of police sirens filled the narrow alleyway within 2 minutes of Ethan's departure. Red and blue lights flashed rhythmically against the rain-slicked brick walls, painting the scene of the thwarted abduction in unnatural colors. First responders, tactical response units, and unmarked federal sedans swarmed the block. Yellow police tape was immediately stretched across the mouth of the alley, blocking off a dozen news vans and clamoring reporters who had rushed to the scene as soon as police scanners picked up the high-profile distress beacon linked to Sterling Global Enterprises. Aria Sterling sat in the back of an emergency services vehicle, a heavy gray shock blanket draped over her shivering shoulders. An EMT was checking her pulse and shining a small light into her eyes, asking routine questions about concussion symptoms, but Aria barely heard them. Her eyes were fixed on the mouth of the side alley where the strange man had vanished. A few yards away, Marcus was being tended to by a paramedic. He had a thick bandage taped over his bleeding temple, his massive frame sitting heavily on the bumper of an ambulance. His jaw was set in a tight, furious line not from the pain of his head injury, but from the searing humiliation of having failed to protect his charge. "Miss Sterling," a sharp voice broke through her thoughts. Aria looked up to see Detective Frank Miller of the NYPD Major Crimes Division approaching. He wore a damp beige trench coat, a notepad flipped open in his hand, his expression grim as he surveyed the tactical gear spread across the cobblestones. "Detective," Aria said, her voice still holding a slight tremble. "How is Marcus?" "He's got a mild concussion and a few stitches, but he'll live," Miller replied, pulling a pen from his pocket. "He's more pissed off than hurt. Right now, I need you to tell me exactly what happened here. The scene out there, it doesn't make much sense." Miller pointed toward the 6 men currently being cuffed, strapped to stretchers, and loaded into police vans under heavy armed guard. "We recovered military-grade submachine guns, thermal breaching charges, and specialized narcotics," Miller continued, leaning in slightly. "These guys aren't local street thugs, Miss Sterling. This was a professional Black Ops kidnap squad. Yet 4 of them have severe blunt force trauma, broken limbs, and crushed windpipes, while the other 2 were knocked cold before they could even squeeze a trigger. Your bodyguard says he was knocked out at the very beginning of the breach. Who else was with you?" Aria closed her eyes for a brief moment, remembering the terrifying sight of the ragged man moving through the rain like a lethal shadow. "It was a man," Aria said softly. "A private security detail your father dispatched?" Miller asked, poising his pen over the notepad. "Did Sterling Global have a secondary covert unit trailing your motorcade?" "No," Aria shook her head, looking Miller dead in the eye. "It was a homeless man." Detective Miller stopped. He stared at her for a long 3 seconds, waiting for a punchline that didn't come. "Miss Sterling, you're under a lot of stress." "I know how it sounds, Detective," Aria interrupted, her voice firming up with conviction. "He came out of the shadows from behind that loading dock. He was wearing a filthy green coat, a black beanie, and torn boots. He didn't have a gun when he started, just a steel crowbar. He dismantled 6 armed men in under 90 seconds to keep them from injecting me with that drug. Miller rubbed his chin, looking back toward the alleyway where crime scene technicians were dusting for prints and picking up spent shell casings. A homeless guy took down an elite military strike team with a crowbar in his bare hands. Did he say who he was? He didn't give me his name, Aria murmured, recalling his cold, intense blue eyes and the quiet pain etched into his voice. When I offered him help, money, anything, he just told me to forget I saw him. He said the world is safer if ghosts stay in the dark. And then he vanished. Miller jotted down a few quick notes, clearly skeptical, though the physical evidence in the alley, the discarded crowbar bearing faint traces of tactical helmet paint, the disarmed rifle found in the dumpster, and the swift precision of the attacker's injuries corroborated her story far more than he was comfortable admitting. Before Miller could ask anything else, a fleet of 3 glossy black Cadillacs pulled up to the edge of the police tape, tires screeching against the wet pavement. The rear door of the lead vehicle flew open, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped out into the pouring rain, completely ignoring the umbrella his personal assistant tried to hold over him. It was Victor Sterling. At 58, Victor was a towering figure in global commerce, a man whose cold demeanor and iron willpower had built Sterling Global into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But right now, he wasn't a CEO. He was a frantic father. Aria! Victor bellowed, shoving past 2 police officers trying to stop him at the barricade. Sir, this is an active crime scene, an officer began, but Victor pushed past him without a second glance, striding directly to the ambulance. Dad! Aria stood up, dropping the blanket as her father pulled her into a fierce, tight embrace. Victor held his daughter, his hand pressing against the back of her head, his breathing heavy with overwhelming relief. For all his billions, for all his power across defense networks and global markets, the thought of losing his only child had paralyzed him with a terror he hadn't felt in decades. Are you hurt? Did they touch you? Victor pulled back, his sharp eyes scanning her face, her hands, her clothes for any sign of injury. I'm fine, Dad. I'm okay. Marcus took the worst of it trying to protect me, Aria reassured him, reaching out to touch his arm. Victor turned his gaze toward Marcus, who stood nearby with a bowed head. Mr. Vance, Victor's voice lowered into a grave, dangerous tone. Explain to me how a 6-car perimeter and an armored Maybach failed within 3 blocks of my tower. Mr. Sterling, they had our exact route, sir, Marcus answered, his voice thick with shame. They knew the lower turnoff. They jammed our comms before we hit the alley. I failed Miss Sterling tonight. I take full responsibility. We found a tracking device on the underside of your rear bumper, Mr. Sterling, Detective Miller chimed in, stepping into the circle. An inside job or a high-level breach of your garage security. Whoever planned this had deep intelligence on your daughter's movements. Victor's eyes narrowed into slits of ice. Julian Carter, he muttered under his breath, the name dripping with venom. Carter Industries had been locked in a bitter, hostile takeover war with Sterling Global for 6 months over a lucrative defense contract for next-generation satellite tracking. Julian Carter was ruthless, backed by shady mercenary syndicates, and lacked any moral compass. Victor knew in his gut that Carter was behind this, even if the law couldn't prove it yet. "Detective," Victor said, turning back to Miller. "Where are the men who attacked my daughter?" "In custody, sir. But off the record, they aren't talking." "And the man who actually saved your daughter?" "A homeless man, Dad," Aria interjected, taking her father's hand. "He saved me. If he hadn't intervened, they would have taken me. He fought them off alone, Dad. He was like a phantom. He saved my life and then disappeared back into the streets." Victor looked at his daughter, seeing the absolute sincerity in her eyes. He knew Aria didn't exaggerate, nor did she panic easily. If she said a nameless drift saved her life against professional mercenaries, then a ghost had indeed fought for her tonight. Victor turned to his personal chief of staff, Arthur Pendleton, who was standing quietly behind him holding an encrypted tablet. "Arthur," Victor commanded, his voice cold, sharp, and leaving no room for debate. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. I want every security camera within a 2-mile radius of this alley pulled and analyzed. I want facial recognition algorithms run against every military, intelligence, and private security database in North America and NATO." Victor turned back toward the dark, wet city streets, his coat soaking in the rain, his expression resolute. "Find me the man who saved my daughter," Victor ordered softly. "I don't care if he's a ghost, a fugitive, or a king in rags. Bring him to me." Meanwhile, 5 blocks away from the chaos of the police scene, Ethan Vance moved through the darkness of an abandoned railway corridor beneath the city. The rain dripped continuously through the rusted iron grates overhead, splashing against his shoulders. His hands were raw, his knuckles bruised and bleeding from the impact of his fists against tactical helmets and body armor. Ethan leaned his back against a cold brick pillar, sliding down until he sat heavily on the damp ground. He pulled off his left boot, shaking out the wet newspaper inside, his breathing heavy and ragged in the dark. The adrenaline that had fueled his body during the fight was completely gone now, leaving behind a deep, exhausting ache that seeped straight into his bones. For 7 years, Ethan had maintained a strict rule: do not interfere. Do not engage. Do not exist. He had survived in the background of society by becoming invisible, by suppressing every instinct that had once made him a lethal commander and a brilliant strategist. Tonight, he had broken his own rule. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the damp brick. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the face of the young woman Aria Sterling. He had recognized her, of course. Anyone who occasionally glanced at a discarded newspaper on a park bench knew the face of the Sterling heiress. But it wasn't her wealth or her name that had made him move tonight. It was the look of pure, helpless terror in her eyes, the exact same look he had seen in his wife Clara's eyes 7 years ago, right before Julian Carter's car bomb took her life and framed Ethan for treason. Ethan gripped his bruised knuckles tightly until his hands shook. "Julian," Ethan whispered to the empty darkness, his voice a low, gravelly snarl that hadn't sounded so dangerous in almost a decade. He knew the operational signatures of the men he had fought tonight. The tactical movement, the specialized thermal breaching gear, the silenced submachine guns, they belonged to Aegis Security, a private mercenary contractors firm owned directly through shell companies by Carter Industries. Julian Carter was still out there, playing his twisted games of power and blood, targeting innocent people to expand his criminal empire while Ethan rotted in the gutters of New York. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around his chest, shivering from the damp cold of the underground tunnel. He had tried to die quietly in the dust. He had tried to let the world forget Ethan Vance ever existed. But tonight, the violence of his past had reached out and touched him once again. And as the low rumble of a subway train vibrated through the earth above him, Ethan realized a bitter truth: once a ghost steps back into the light, it can never truly return to the dark.